see. Okay, going back to Luke chapter 6 then. The discussion of the man with the withered hand took from verse 6 through verse 11. Luke chapter 6, verse 6. If I've got it written down in my notes correctly. Anyway, we did leave off that last final verse, verse 11, where we're told in the aftermath of Jesus' reprimand of them and healing of the man's problem. We're told in verse 11, and they, that is the religious leaders, were filled, the King James Version says, with madness. They were filled with madness and communed one with another what they might do to Jesus. The significance of Jesus healing the man is totally lost upon these people. They don't see any significance, apparently. They don't see that this demands an understanding that Jesus has come from God. As Nicodemus would later confess, we know that thou art a teacher come from God, for no man can do these miracles that thou doest except God be with him. Nicodemus was able to see the significance of the miracles of Jesus. Not just see the miracles, but what those miracles said about Jesus and his relationship to God the Father. These people, who are the official leaders and teachers of the nation of Israel, don't have that kind of perception. They only saw what they wanted to see. And when they don't get what they want, we're told there in verse 11, they're filled with madness. Madness. They're completely insensitive. They have no compassion for the man that has been healed. They're insensitive to Jesus' desire to help people in adversity. And again, the reality of the miracle doesn't change them. They don't argue that Jesus performed a miracle, for quite obviously he did before their eyes and the eyes of many others. But they don't understand the significance of that. They're filled with madness, and they commune one with another what they might do with Jesus. They're doing harm on the Sabbath. I touched on that concept, but I didn't use this verse to make that point. They're doing harm on the Sabbath. In fact, that is even more emphasized by both Matthew and Mark in their accounts, where they say that they took counsel together how they might destroy him or kill him. So they are guilty of conspiracy to commit murder. Is that something that's suitable for the Sabbath, or the other day for that matter, of course? But aren't they guilty of greater sin than they think Jesus is? Yes.
They were so centered on trying to find something wrong with him that they were blinded to anything else.
And that's a very good way of expressing. That's a very good thought. You're absolutely right. Sometimes if we get so interested in one thing, we can fail to observe something else. Okay, I just want to stick that in because we didn't read it last time, at least not together. We didn't read that verse 11, and I don't want to skip anything along the way. So there we have the reaction of the religious leaders to Jewish healing of that man, and what it says about them. It says far more about them than what it says about Jesus. We then turn to verse 12. And verse 12 is Jesus calling out of his many disciples the 12 that are to serve as apostles. If you'll look with me at page 38 of your study guide, this is point 16. Page 38, point 16. And it's entitled there, The Calling of the 12 Apostles. That is, by calling, I mean their appointment. He calls them out of the greater body of disciples to be his apostles. So the calling of the 12 apostles, Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16, which I summarize in two sentences, one long and one short. After an entire night spent in prayer, Jesus selects from among his disciples 12 men to serve as his apostles, his special messengers or delegates. The names of each are given in the historian's record. So that's what we look at now. Luke chapter 6, beginning at verse 12. Verse 12 tells us, and it came to pass in those days that he went out into a mountain to pray. and continued all night in prayer to God. The fact he spends all night in prayer emphasizes two things. It emphasizes, of course, Jesus' devotion to prayer, his belief in the power of prayer, and also the significance of what's going to follow this. He's preparing for something. Jesus was a great man of prayer. He was committed to prayer. Here he continues all night in prayer. When was the last time you spent the entire night praying? Have we ever spent the entire night praying? But he spends all night in prayer, emphasizing the seriousness of what he's praying about and also his devotion to the Father that elicits his prayer. I want you to notice the word mountain. He went out into a mountain. We'll bring that subject up, the reference to the mountain momentarily. But he went out up into a mountain and continued all night in prayer to God. There are several times where Jesus spent the entire night in prayer. This is one. Makes it especially significant. Verse 13. And when it was day, he called unto him his disciples. The word disciple means a learner or a student of one. One is a student of another. He is a learner from another. So they are bound together, the disciples and the one who teaches them or leads them in this relationship. Jesus is the master. He's the teacher. They are the disciples. They're the learners. They're the followers. The word disciple and apostle are not identical. One might be, and we will see that in just a moment, both a disciple and an apostle, but the two terms mean different things. Welcome. We're glad to have you all with us. You've come in since we started. He called unto him his disciples, all those who were following his teaching and seeking to learn more about him. A lot of verse 13 says, and of them, that is out of the greater body or group of disciples, he chose 12. What is the significance of the 12? I don't know. Some have suggested the 12 may be sort of a New Testament counterpart to the Old Testament 12 tribes of Israel. That could be. But I'm not sure that can be proven from Scripture, but that could be. Some have suggested the 12 in a kind of extrapolation of the idea that maybe they're the counterpart to the 12 tribes, saying this might be an indication that Christ is establishing the new Israel to replace the old Israel of the Old Testament. That might be also. I'm not sure that it is, but it makes sense. But the fact it makes sense doesn't make necessarily what he's saying. Even if we could be proven that the statement itself is true, it doesn't necessarily mean that's what Jesus is saying in his statement. So I'm not sure why he chose 12, but he did, and I know it was the right thing for him to do, or he wouldn't do it. So he chooses these 12 apostles, and if you want to hold the view that they represent the New Testament counterpart to the Old Testament tribe of Israel, more power to you. You may be right. I don't know for sure, but that might be the right idea. Or if you want to see in this Jesus establishing a new spiritual Israel in place of the old physical Israel. Again, more power to you. You may be right in that. I'm not sure, because we're simply not told why. We're just being told the fact.
I'm trying to remember when we studied Revelation, it seemed like the number 12 had a significance to the Jewish people.
And it certainly is true. The Jews placed special emphasis upon the word 12. It had a special meaning to them. And, of course, at this point, all of Jesus' disciples are Jews. And so there very well could be a connection in his thought, his intention, and in their thinking between this 12 and something else. He takes the disciples, and from those 12, from the disciples rather, he chooses 12, whom we're told also he named apostles in the latter part of the verse. From among his disciples, who are a great body by this time, great group, he chooses out 12, and those 12 disciples will become the 12 apostles. I've already said that a disciple is a learner or a student. That's what all of these have been, including those who subsequently are chosen by Jesus to serve as apostles. They've all been, and still are, learners or teachers. But now 12 are made apostles. The word apostle means one sent forth. When you were sent forth by a superior on a particular mission, you were an apostle. If someone has a special a position that he occupies, but in that position he is called to that position or authorized for that position by someone greater than himself, who is sending him out as a personal representative. I'm trying to remember the two terms I use to refer to an apostle: a special messenger or a delegate. You know, so a delegate is one that is chosen by others to act on their behalf. Special messengers, that really is a very essential part of the role of these apostles, for they are going to become Jesus' special messengers to the world. They're going to carry his word. After his death, his resurrection, and his ascension back to heaven, these are the ones who are going to carry his word to the whole world. They are his apostles. So let's not confuse the two words. The apostles were also disciples, but not all of the disciples were apostles. That was their unique role or service in God's scheme of things. He then identifies them by name. Here they are. Now the names don't completely match. It was very common in that day for a person to have more than one name by which he was known. Most of us have more than one name, but they had more than one name by which they were commonly known. He begins, as do all of the listing of the apostles, with the apostle Peter. That doesn't necessarily mean Peter was a greater apostle than the rest. We're told in verse 14 that their names are Simon, whom he also named Peter. Jesus chose Simon to be an apostle. There is no statement of Scripture that he is greater than any other disciples or the other apostles. Jesus named him Peter, meaning a rock, for the stability that will later characterize Peter's life. At this time, and at the time Jesus called him a rock, he was anything but a rock. But when you get to the book of Acts, in the opening chapters of the book of Acts, and halfway through the book of Acts, you find he is a great rock. He's actually, a more literal translation would be a stone rather than a rock. There's Simon Peter, and Andrew his brother, James and John. There are the four fishermen. The four first ones called to follow Jesus are subsequently made apostles of Jesus: Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Then there are some that we may be a little less familiar with, and some of them may bear the same name as other people in the Bible. Philip, this is not Philip the evangelist that we read about in the book of Acts. This is a separate man, a different man. His name was Philip. And Bartholomew. Matthew, this is the writer of the first gospel narrative, the apostle Matthew. Matthew and Thomas, whom we have come to refer commonly, though perhaps not somewhat unfairly, as Doubting Thomas. We think of him as Doubting Thomas because he was the one when the disciples told him that Jesus had appeared to them after his death and burial, that he had appeared to them in the upper room. He said, "Only if I see him with my own eyes will I believe it." He doubted their testimony, even though their testimony was unanimous, and even though Jesus had forecast his resurrection. Thomas doubted. But the next Lord's Day, the next week, in the evening, when the apostles were again assembled, Thomas was present on that occasion. And as soon as he sees Jesus, he confesses his faith in him. Let's not be too hard on Thomas then. Thomas did not demand any more evidence to believe than did the other disciples had already received. Thomas only asked for what the other apostles already had: a personal view of Jesus. That's a pretty tone, isn't it? I like that. My phone has a harsh sound.
Yeah.
Keep thinking maybe I should change it. Anyway, back to Thomas. The other apostles had seen the resurrected Christ and they believed. Thomas had not seen the resurrected Christ. He did not believe. But once he did see him, he did believe, just like the others did. So he had the same amount of testimony as did the other apostles. So before we are too critical of doubting Thomas, let's just remember the other apostles have seen Jesus, and Thomas is simply asking for that same opportunity. And some of us require a whole lot more testimony or evidence than Thomas did. But this is Thomas. Then also in verse 15, following Matthew and Thomas, James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called Zelotes, or your version may say Simon the Zealot. We notice then there are two Simons, Simon Peter, verse 14, and Simon the Zealot in verse 15. The word zealot refers to someone who is very committed to and almost upset, well, not just almost, really obsessed with a certain thing. Among the Jews, the most likely reference is to that band of people who were so determined to get rid of the Jewish or the Roman oppression of their nation that they were prepared to go to war with Rome, to break off the yoke of Roman oppression of their people. Though also some suggest that the word zealot simply means passionate about some cause or something, and they suggest there could be a religious connotation also. It may be simply that this group of people, and this particular one chosen to be an apostle, was simply very zealous for the law of Moses. There were those kind of zealots also, it is suggested. And some would say there's no way to determine whether this was a religious reference or a political reference. If it was a religious reference, it simply meant that this man was very zealous for the law of Moses and its observance. On the other hand, if it's a political reference, then he's a part of a party, a group of people, somewhat loosely attached, but a part of a body of people who were determined to liberate Palestine from Roman domination. Yes?
You know, either way, it'd have to be a powerful presence of Jesus to get him to relent on either one of those.
You're absolutely right. Absolutely. He had to have a greater confidence in Jesus, a greater commitment to Jesus than his former cause. No one is harder to convert to anything than a person who's zealous over something else. To break that tie in order for them to give a new allegiance. It takes a tremendous personality in the case of Jesus, a tremendous cause in the same case of Jesus to get that job done. Yes, Elaine?
Saul was a good example.
Oh, Saul was another good example. You're right.
Yeah.
He certainly was. No one was more zealous for the cause of Judaism than Saul was.
Yeah.
So he was, in the religious sense, a zealot, though he's never referred to in Scripture as a zealot. But certainly his zealous tendencies are described for us in Scripture. I have always, perhaps without adequate cause, regarded Simon as being a political zealot, one who desired the liberation of Palestine from Roman occupation. But I do not deny the possibility that the reference may be religious. Anyway, this person, as zealous, since hence the word zealot, he's so as zealous as he was, whether politically or religiously, he gives that up for Jesus and devotes his zeal now to the cause of Christ. Verse 16, and then there was Judas, not Judas Iscariot. He'll come on later. It's interesting, I'll just stick this in now in case I forget it later, that all of the listings of apostles begin with Peter and they end with Judas Iscariot. The other names may be in different orders, but these are the first and the last. But verse 16 is a different Judas. Incidentally, where Judas is a form of the same name as Jude. One of Jesus' brothers was named Jude, and he's the author of the book of Jude, the book of Jude in the New Testament. But this is not the brother of Jesus. We're told in Judas, the brother of James, and Judas Iscariot then, which also was the traitor. He doesn't leave it to us to think, who was this Judas Iscariot? He wants to make it clear. He wants to identify from the first reference to this man by name. He wants to identify exactly who he is. He was the traitor. Bill, did you have a thought?
Yeah, Judas, the son of James, is also known, as you already pointed out, Theudas, and also Bartholomew is known as Nathaniel.
Okay.
And so, like you said, some of them had other names.
Right.
And
And those references are found. If you check the parallels, if you have a reference Bible and it gives you references to other places, you can check Matthew's account and Mark's account, and you can get the other alternate names. Okay, those are the 12 that Jesus chooses out of his disciples or followers to be now not merely a follower of his, but a representative of his, a delegate of his, whom he sends forth to the world. He doesn't immediately send them forth, but that's their ultimate mission. That brings us then to verse 17, which usually follows verse 16, I guess. That was a profound statement, wasn't it? Okay, verse 17. Verses 17 through 49 is a tremendous sermon of Jesus, but a sermon that is discussed as to exactly the identity of the sermon. When you read verses 17 through 49, all the way through, verses 17 through 49, you'll notice it's marked, unmistakable similarity to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount of Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. There has always been, or for a long time anyway, very long time, if not always been, a difference of view among Bible students who have researched it and studied it, analyzed it, as to whether this sermon in Luke chapter 6 is simply Luke's account of the same sermon that Matthew reports or records in Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7, or whether it is a different sermon offered on a different occasion, but it, of course, has parallels to the Sermon on the Mount. And every time I study it, I flip over as to which one I'm going to be. One time I think it's the Sermon on the Mount. On another occasion I think, no, it's a different sermon. And then the next time I study, I'd go back to, yes, it's his description of the Sermon on the Mount, taking from the Sermon on the Mount the elements that he saw. And then I flip back to the other view, that it's a different sermon entirely. If it is the Sermon on the Mount, well, it is the longest sermon, in any case, in Luke chapter 6. If it's the Sermon on the Mount, then it is clearly the best known of Jesus' sermons, for the Sermon on the Mount is the best known of Jesus' sermon. We are not told, incidentally, and this is worth keeping in mind, in either account, Matthew or Luke, that either of them are recording everything Jesus said at that time. Have you ever taken notes on a sermon that someone delivers, or anything that people deliver orally? It's really hard to get it all down. And even if you get it all down, there are certain points that are more meaningful to you, and maybe more meaningful to somebody else with whom you want to share it than are other principles. So it may be that both Matthew and Mark took from the same sermon the elements, the points that were of greatest importance to their prospective readers. They are recording this not merely as stenographers to write it all down, but they're writing it for distinct purposes. Matthew's purpose is not identical with Mark's or Luke's purpose. So it may be just each one's individual view of the same sermon, And if there's something in one that is not in the other, that doesn't mean that one made a mistake and left something out, or that the other presumed to write something himself to fill in the gap. It's hard to say. It's difficult to say whether this is the same sermon but looked at from two different vantage points, with two different emphases as far as their recording of it, or a completely separate sermon. One of the reasons for the disparity of judgment as to whether they are the same sermon is the fact that Matthew chapter 5 verse 1 tells us that Jesus went up into a mountain and called his disciples, and they came up to the mountain, and he presented the sermon here, or there on the mountain. Luke will tell us that Jesus goes to a plain. Well, in the King James Version, some of the older versions, it says that. But some of the newer versions say, as the New American Standard Version does, a level place. Is that how it works? Have I got that right? A level place? So is this one sermon on a mountain while the other is down in a valley on a plain? Or is this just a level place on a mountain? Jesus goes up to the mountain and chooses his apostles. Then he comes down from the mountain. But it's conceivable he comes down to a level place on the mountain and presents the sermon. Really, it makes no difference. Whatever is recorded in either account, Jesus said, and you can be absolutely sure of that. Whether you view them as two different views of one sermon, or two different expressions of one sermon, or two entirely different sermons delivered on different occasions, it makes no difference to the content. Oh, I said that Matthew chapter 5 locates the Sermon on the Mount as being on a mount, that is delivered on the mount. But Luke also refers to the mountain that Jesus went up to pray in verse 12, and from which Jesus comes down in verse 17. So you got a mountain there. So it very well could be just a lower level area of that mountain. Let's look at what the sermon says. Beginning at verse 17. And he came down with them and stood in the plain. There's the level place. And the company of the disciples and a great multitude of people out of all Judea and Jerusalem and from the sea coast of Tyre and Sidon. It's not necessarily understood that all these people from all these different places were disciples. He refers to the company of the disciples and a great number of people, which indicate there are others who are not his disciples, or perhaps simply interested in finding out what it's all about and would subsequently become his disciples. So it seems like it's something of a mixed audience. His disciples, those who were already his followers, and also others who were interested in what he had to say. And they all came near to hear him and to be healed of their diseases. That's something that is not stated in reference to the Sermon on the Mount. But that doesn't mean it didn't occur. Matthew perhaps simply did not record it.
We
Yes.
don't really know where this mountain is, do we?
No, we do not.
I always picture it as being over by the Dead Sea, or not the Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee somewhere, because Tyre and Sidon are way over on the coast.
Yes, they are.
People came from a long distance.
Yeah,
Probably.
they did indeed. And since you mentioned that, I might stick in the note, and I wasn't going to because it cannot be proven one or the other. But Tyre and Sidon were actually Gentile cities. So it is possible that there were not only Jews at this mountain, or this level place, this plain, or whatever it was. It is possible that there were Gentiles also. But there were Jews living in Tyre and Sidon, even though they were Gentile cities. But it is significant that it refers to Judea, which is the southern portion of Palestine, and Jerusalem, the capital of Judea, and then Tyre and Sidon. And there's a fair piece of ground between those places. Yes.
You said Tyre and Sidon were, Gentile cities
Yes.
with a few Jews in them. Then What's the difference? Is there something significant why Samaria was so much more hated than Tyre and?
Yes, yeah. We'll discuss that when we get to that point. But Samaria was made up of, I don't like to use the expression, but it gets the point across better than going around the big bush to describe it. Half-breeds. In Jewish thought, they were half-breeds. They were descended from Jews, but they were the Jews who were their progenitors were also involved with Gentiles. There was intermarriage between the Jews and the Gentiles. And so the Samaritans were not fully accepted by the Gentiles, and they definitely were not accepted by the Jews. And so they were hated. They were looked down upon. And so it was common to refer to people who were hated or looked down upon as Samaritans. Though in Scripture it's usually used literally, if not always, literally of the Samaritans.
So, I'm going to get this right. The Jews didn't care for the Gentiles. Did the Gentiles not care for the Jews either?
There was mutual animosity,
Okay.
as there typically is. If one group hates the others, normally the other group will hate back. Except in the case of Christians, and we dare not do that. Jesus is going to teach us that in the first part of this sermon. But generally, people of the world, if they are hated, if they are oppressed, or in any way abused, they typically respond with hatred. Hatred breeds hatred in our world. And it takes the power of the Lord and His influence and His teaching to bring about a peace and accord between people who formerly hated one another. Okay, these people came both to hear Jesus teach in verse 17 and to be healed of their diseases. Well, we've already looked at, even though there's been a couple of weeks gap here, it was just in the previous portion of the same chapter where we had some of the healings of Jesus take place. And the fame of Jesus, of course, went out. People talk about things that really impress them, especially if they are helpful to them. And so people spread the word about Jesus as a healer, which prompted other people to want to come to be healed of Jesus. So they've come on a twofold mission: to be healed of whatever diseases they may have or their friends may have, and to hear the teaching of Jesus. Verse 18 continues the thought in regard to the healing. And they were vexed with unclean spirits, and they were healed. Even the spirit world was no match for Jesus. Verse 19. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for there went virtue out, that is power, out from him, and healed them all. They wanted to get close to Jesus. Now that doesn't say that the people had to touch Jesus for him to heal them, for we know better than that. On other occasions, they've had no bodily contact with one another, but Jesus healed them. But these people, in their zeal and their desire to be healed by Jesus, would come up and they touch him. If Jesus were here today,